The title of my talk today is Can Data Science Combat Fake News? And during the course of this talk, since this talk is being delivered remotely, I would encourage if somebody in the audience has any questions to post questions in this link, which is paulev.com/deepakp. I would be able to see the questions as they come in, but I'll probably take all the questions together at the end of the talk. So going quickly to the outline of the talk, we'll start talking about fake news in primitive and modern times. We'll talk about some insights on fake news and cognition, and we'll look at AI approaches to fake news, which will include both supervised and unsupervised approaches. We'll look at some data sets as well as the way forward, and I assume that some of the research directions which are potentially promising might be of interest to the young people in the audience. So going quickly to fake news and its importance. So in 2016, Oxford Dictionary, Oxford Dictionary has this thing called the word of the year, where it recognizes one of the words that caused quite a lot of influence in the world, in the global state of affairs that year, as the word of the year. So the Oxford Dictionary's word of the year in 2016 was post-truth, which is another way of saying fake news. And the Collins Dictionary has a similar thing, the Collins word of the year, and they chose fake news as the word of the year in 2017. And they provided a definition of fake news as well, which is that false and often sensational information disseminated under the guise of news could be called as fake news. Okay, so let's look at some of the primitive forms of fake news. And this is fake news from 1522 in the Common Era. So there was this guy called Piero Aretino. He was an Italian author as well as a poet, I suppose. So he lived from 1492 to 1556. And when he was in his 20s or 30s, in 1522, the Pope at the time died. Okay, and so there was an election to hold the Pope, and so there were people trying to get their person elected as a Pope. So Piero Aretino had his own favorite candidates, and those were candidates from the so-called Medici family. So what he did was he wanted to influence the election in favor of the Medici family, the candidates from the Medici family. So what he did was he went to this famous statue in Italy, and where a lot of the people who would potentially be able to influence the papal elections would pass by. And there was this wall beneath the statue. And what he did was he wrote a lot of verses. He was, of course, a good poet. He wrote a lot of verses which said wicked things about the other people, about the other people other than those in the Medici family. And the Medici family was the one that he was favoring. So he wrote a lot of wicked poems about other people and posted it beneath the wall, on the wall beneath the statue. So I'll just highlight the wall beneath the statue there. So he just posted a lot of these things. So his intent was to influence the elections in favor of the Medici family candidates. Okay, so there are of course a lot of other kinds of fake news that existed in the primitive times, and we also have within Indian epics also there are instances of fake news being used for achieving various intents and so on. But I picked up this example to illustrate one of the primitive fake news examples because of some striking similarities, some striking trivial similarities. Some trivia, some striking similarities which are more like trivia, which are not very substantive, with the fake news that we see in the present era. And that is that fake news is often used in the present era to influence elections, and that has been one of the primary concerns about fake news, and that has prompted a lot of inquiry, scholarly inquiry into the nature of fake news, into fake news from political science perspectives, from data science, from a lot of other kinds of directions as well. And the fake news, this is just a coincidence that fake news is nowadays posted on the wall because Facebook chose to call our profile pages as walls. All right, so fake news gets posted on the wall many a time, whereas the fake news from this 1522 BC, 1522 Common Era also happened to be posted on a wall that was beneath the sculpture in one of the prominent city center locations in Italy. Okay, so let's move on. And one of the and I would like to illustrate some examples of fake news from the present era, just to give you a sense of what we are talking about, right? So there is this thing, which is the 2000 rupee note, which is the highest denomination note that we have in circulation within India, within the Republic of India, right? And so this has something to do with fake news. And what does it have to do? And those who might remember the incidents of November 8 of 2016 would remember some of these aspects. So at that time, when this note was first introduced, there was a big furore. There was a lot of propaganda about what goes into these notes, and one of them was that the 2000 rupee currency contains something called a nano GPS chip. Okay, so let me just go through that because it's an interesting kind of fake news. The unique feature of the nano GPS chip, which is embedded within the currency note, is that it doesn't need any power source. It only acts as a signal reflector. When a satellite sends a signal requesting location, the NGC reflects back the signal from the location, giving precise location coordinates and the serial number of the currency back to the satellite. And this way, every NGC embedded currency can easily be tracked and located, even if it is kept up to 120 meters. So you should look at the precision there, like 120 meters. It's not 100, it's not 200, it's 120 meters below the ground level. The NGC can't be tampered with or removed without damaging the currency note, which essentially, if you damage the currency note, you're invalidating the currency note, so people wouldn't do that. So anybody with some amount of knowledge of electronics would be able to quickly debunk it, but this fake news got a lot of traction at that time, and it was covered by prominent media sources, mainstream media sources, who covered this news and did not bother to apologize when it was proven fake shortly afterward. But this was definitely a fake news, but it was so impactful that if you just search for NGC chip on Google, and this is what you get. The instances of fake news is what you get. So let's move on to another example, and this was something that got a lot of popularity within Kerala circles in May 2018, if I remember correctly. So this was the fake news related to having shrimp and citrus juice together. Okay, so I'll show some excerpt here, which says that shrimp contains arsenic pentoxide, and when the person ate shrimp, so this is in the form of a narrative of a person who died because of having this combo, right, the shrimp and citrus combo. She drank vitamin C at the same time, and apparently vitamin C and arsenic pentoxide cause some kind of a reaction, which results in the release of a fatally poisonous substance, which resulted in the death of this person. Of course, there are these two vitamin C is there, arsenic pentoxide is there in traces, and it so happens that a lot of experts were roped in to look at the veracity of this news, and a lot of people wrote long articles in the mainstream media sources such as Manorama and Mathrubhumi, where they talked about the existence of these substances, but that the existence of these substances are at such trace levels that you might need to eat up to 200 kilograms of shrimp to be able to get anything close to even a discomfort, right? And I would like to bring your attention to this particular thing. It says collected via email in November 2011. So November 2011, in some other communities, this fake news had a brilliant run, right? And in May 2018, coming to Kerala, we had this fake news all over the place again. So this will relate back to this one, but essentially what I wanted to highlight here is that fake news is not a one-time event. If somebody dies, of course the news of the death comes into prominence, and then it goes away, it fades away, because there are other news occupying the front pages on the day after that, and so on and so forth. Whereas this kind of fake news has multiple lives. So it comes up, peaks at one point in time, and it slowly fades away. But after some time, people are again vulnerable to this fake news, and it comes back up again. So fake news has multiple lives in some sense. Okay, so let's move on, and let's look at the impact of fake news. Towards the impact of fake news, I would like to point out a very geographically pertinent example, right? This is from Kerala, so where there was this actor called Jishnu Raghavan, who unfortunately is no more. He succumbed to cancer of a particular variety. But here he talks about the initial days of his cancer diagnosis, and the experiences that he went through. So I'll read out some parts of it. So he says, friends, I'm getting a lot of suggestions to try Lakshmi Taru and Mullata, which are basically two kinds of herbal remedies which were advertised through fake news channels, as magic remedies for cancer. So this was popularized through social media. I took the risk of trying it on myself and many other popular alternate medicines suggested by friends and family. I couldn't control my tumor, and rather took me to a very dangerous situation. And it so happened that the tumor, could not be controlled later on. Possibly because of late switch over to the conventional medical sources as against these magic remedies and so on. But maybe because of other reasons as well. We don't want to speculate that. But essentially, there was this person who went through this, who was pumped in with a lot of fake news, and that took him for a ride essentially. Okay, but I should also say that we should appreciate these kinds of confessions, because it's not very often that these kinds of things come up, because you go through some tragedy, some personal tragedy, you typically wouldn't want to share it outside. So the back reporting of fake news in the health domain is very poor, because people if you go to a doctor and tell him or her that you went through this magic remedy, you were fooled by this magic remedy, fake news, and you took that, there is a chance that the doctor may not respond all that well. So the fear of negative responses generally intimidates the back reporting of fake news effects, at least in the health domain. Okay. So let's move on to some more details, right? Let's concretize certain things. What are the definitions of fake news? So one definition is that fake news is something that is intentionally false and shared via the internet. This was one definition. Fake news, as we saw in the primitive times, was not shared via the internet, but it was just through other kinds of channels. And there was another definition. This was by Cohen in 2017. He says that everything from malicious stories to political propaganda is fake news. And something that is more agreeable would be the third definition, which says that fake news is a continuum. Some news sources have some kind of bias. Certain others misinterpret certain things. You could legitimately misinterpret certain things, and some others start misrepresenting certain things, and that's when it really gets to fake news. So in the misrepresentation territory, you wouldn't have any confusion as to whether you should call it fake news or not. Everybody would agree that that is fake news. In the misinterpretation territory, maybe some people might have mixed opinions, and in the bias territory, maybe much fewer people would agree to call that a fake news. So let's look at some insights from the psychology literature on fake news and cognition. So there is this thing that fake news spreads. Fake news spreads very, very quickly, very rapidly, right? And let's look at some of the reasons why it happens. And one of them has to do with something called the logical fallacy, or essentially an inclination of the human mind to be irrational in some sense, and that is called the confirmation bias. That in particular, I would like to draw your attention to the confirmation bias. So the confirmation bias says that you hear certain things, and you have some predefined beliefs or beliefs that you already hold in your brain, right? And whenever you hear certain things, if it intersects with what you believe, then you value that much more than if it doesn't intersect with what you believe. So this intersection between these circles is the thing that you value much, right? And what you hear or see and what you believe, so whatever comes in the intersection is what you value much. And the others are valued, but not as valued as things in the intersection. And in these days of social media, right, you are not deciding what you would want to see or hear. There are a lot of, it's not even one media company. It's not even a Manorama or Mathrubhumi that is deciding what you would listen or what you would read. It's a bunch of different people engaged in a social network, right? And it's even the social network algorithms itself. So in the days of social media, what you hear or see can be manipulated easily. can be quite easily manipulated. You quickly have this echo chamber effect. So whenever that is manipulatable, so there is this mad rush across algorithms, across people whom you're connected to give you what you value, right? So that creates a kind of echo chamber. And what eventually turns out is that you would end up seeing some reassuring lies, and you would value that much because regardless of it being a lie, it is something that you hear or see, and it kind of blends with what you believe because it's a reassuring thing, right? And whenever you see some inconvenient truth, you probably discard it because you don't value it, because it's not intersecting with what you believe, right? And once you do that, once you start doing that over and again, then the algorithm learns that you're inclined towards certain topics, and those might be correlated with lies, and those might be correlated with reassuring your beliefs and so on. So it shows more and more of those kinds of things, and you kind of follow people who give you that kind of information, and they produce more of such content and so on and so forth. So that creates an echo chamber effect. So this creates an environment where the fake news can spread kind of very easily. So let's look at yet another thing, which is about the persistence of fake news, right? So what is the point in generating fake news if the fake news is going to be debunked very quickly afterward? So what's the point in claiming that X said something if X himself or herself is going to come out and hold a press conference within the next half an hour and say that well, he or she did not say that, so it's going to be debunked very soon. What's the point in having that kind of fake news? So people try to understand those incentives, and one of those experiments is to do with fake news persistence. So some people conducted this experiment, and this was you can look up the paper, which is in Kersmacher and Reutz in 2016. They wanted to study the persistence of fake news, so they recruited a bunch of people and told them the story of Natalie, the nurse. Okay, so Natalie is a nurse, and she is a kind nurse to people, to patients. But somehow she has this kind of a weird habit and weird inclination that she would steal hospital supplies, go and sell it to other people, and make money out of it, and use that money to buy designer wear. Okay, so this was the story that was told to some people. Okay, and after telling them the story, they were asked to rate Natalie on trustworthiness. Obviously, Natalie would not rate very highly on trustworthiness because, you just heard that she steals. She uses the stolen things for her own personal gain, not for charity, and so on and so forth. So she doesn't score very highly on trustworthiness. However, then later on, right after this, right after collecting these ratings, the same people were told that, the story of naturally stealing certain hospital supplies was a lie planted by some co-worker or something, was essentially some kind of fake news. So don't believe that. She's actually a kind nurse, and she treats patients well, and so on. So the story about Natalie stealing stuff was fake news. So this was revealed to the audience, and then this audience was asked once again to rate Natalie on trustworthiness. Okay, so you would expect some kind of deviation between them, between these ratings, because earlier they believed that it was Natalie was a person who steals information, who steals medicines and uses it for her own personal gain, and secondly they were told that it was that was no longer true, and people saw that there was a sharp difference, but still. When you compare it to the ratings given by some other set of people who were not told about this fake news story, then there is a significant deviation, in the sense that people who heard about this fake news story were influenced by that fake news to rate her on trustworthiness kind of lower than if they did not hear the story about stealing stuff. So the first negative rating, which was based on the fake news, was seen to influence the second rating, which was after the revelation that it was actually fake, right? So what this means is humans have a lot of trouble upon hearing fake news to actually be able to shrug off all the influence of fake news and make decisions as if they had not heard that fake news. So it kind of primes them into some kind of a mentality where they are still influenced by the fake news even after they're told that it was a fake news. So this kind of brings this topic of election time fake news into question, and it offers some interesting perspectives into it. For example, in October 2016, there was this fake news that Pope Francis endorses Donald Trump for president, right? And in October 2016, right, a few days after that, it was shown to be false. It was shown that, well, I guess I don't remember exactly what happened, but the papal office issued something saying that there was no such statement made by Pope Francis. And in November 2016, you had the U.S. elections, right? So going by the persistence argument, you can potentially think that maybe the fake news over there in October 2016, although it was debunked soon after, could potentially have influenced electoral results, electoral outcome. And this happens quite a bit in India as well. So 1 week before the Karnataka elections in 2018, there was this WhatsApp forward. In India, most of the fake news transmission occurs through WhatsApp, as you would know. So there was this fake news forward that there is an agency called Janata Ki Baat, which predicts a huge BJP gain in Karnataka assembly elections, and they went on to say that BJP would win up to 135 seats, JDS will win up to 45 seats, Congress will win 35 seats, etc. But the reality is not that. But this kind of a fake news that BJP is going to be the winner could potentially have influenced some voters who are kind of in a wavering position in order to vote for the potential winner. However, as you know, the Karnataka elections gave out a completely different results, where the JDS and Congress came together and mustered enough numbers to form the government, right? And you might remember, well, this is Karnataka elections 2018, and this was a similar case happened in the UP elections as well. I guess that was in 2017, which was once again favoring the same party. Well, of course, I mean, the party could differ, but fake news at election time has been used as a tool in India as well quite often, is what I wanted to highlight here. Okay, so let's move on. The story so far is that fake news has been around, and it's been more around in the present times. Fake news spreads fast, well, thanks to things like confirmation bias and so on, and fake news persists in the mind long after it has been shown to be fake. Okay, so let's go to data science and fake news, which is the core topic of our talk today, right? So data types of relevance. So whenever we are trying to do some data science approaches for fake news detection, we are looking at particular data types and how we can harness that data types in the form of an algorithmic technology, algorithm or a technology, in order to identify fake news, right? So some of these things are from the ICDM 2017 tutorial. So let's say that there is this tweet, okay, and this is a screenshot of a tweet. So there is the source of information or the source of misinformation in case it is fake, and so on. So that is potentially a person in a social network, and there is a content of misinformation that could contain the hashtag, the URL, the image, etc. In this case, there are no URLs, no images, no hashtags, but those could all be there in the content. And there is, of course, the context of the misinformation, which is the date, time, and location at which it was produced. And there is propagation of misinformation, which is retweet, reply, like, and so on and so forth, right? So there are a lot of people liking these things. There are a lot of people commenting on it. There are a lot of people retweeting it, and so on and so forth. So there is a lot of propagation information, especially when it comes to microblogging sites like Twitter. So there are a lot of information. There is a lot of information out there that could be leveraged for fake news detection algorithms, right? So let's look at two families of approaches, and this organization of approaches into two families is from the AAA 2018 tutorial by Hassan and Lee, which you can look up later on. So the AI approach uses an underlying assumption that there would be patterns, there would be data patterns that can help tell apart fake news from legitimate news sources. And the database approach takes a different route in going on to attack this challenge, which is that if a news story is not well supported by a knowledge base of facts, then it might be fake. Okay, so they do some fact checking against some knowledge bases, and if the knowledge base doesn't support the news story, it could be fake. So let's look at critiquing these kinds of approaches, right? So the AI approach is better at identifying emerging fake news topics because it learns the model at a higher level. So it learns the model at a pattern level. Right? It doesn't care about the particular content maybe as much. And so in certain cases, the content patterns could be very specific to the topics that are in the training set. However, there could be underlying patterns, whereas the DB approach requires a continuously updated knowledge base in order to identify unseen kind of fake news. So, this might be okay when you're talking about medical kind of fake news or health kind of fake news, where you're talking about shrimp, citrus combo, etc., and so forth, and so on and so forth. But it may not be possible, or it may not generalize well to emerging kind of fake news, which relates to some real-time events and so on. So those are the pros and cons of different approaches. So DB approach, it gives you a much more explanative way of saying why this is fake, because it is contradicted by these particular facts, particular factors in the knowledge base and so on. Okay, so the families of AI approaches. So you can think of the data science approaches as being of two categories themselves. So one is supervised approaches, uses labeled data in order to build fake news identification approaches. And the unsupervised approaches, which the predominant stream of unsupervised approach is something which treats fake news detection as an anomaly detection approach. It treats deviation from the common character as being anomalous and thus likely to be fake. Okay, so there are these two families of approaches, and of course they have the pros and cons. Supervised approaches require training data, but they might be able to do a much better job than unsupervised approaches. And unsupervised approaches, of course, are very useful for cold start kind of scenarios where you don't have any training data, nor do you find yourself in a position to be able to create training data in that domain. In which case, unsupervised approaches are the only ones that you can use. Okay, so let's look at the broad framework of supervised fake news identification. You would collect a bunch of fake news, okay, and you would collect a bunch of legitimate news as well. And the fake news could be collected from sources such as Snopes.com, and in India we have fact-checking websites like Alt News and so on. So you can look at what they have identified. You can look at them. They do some manual verification of some stories, and you can look at those things which have been verified to be false, verified to be fake, right? So you have some articles from Snopes, some articles from Alt News, which go into the fake news corpus, and you have some articles from more legitimate sources like BBC News or Reuters that go into the legitimate news corpus. Of course, these should be topically coherent. It cannot be that the fake news is all related to sports, and the legitimate news is all related to politics. That won't suffice, because a classifier would learn to differentiate topics. So it should all be related to the same topic, but it should be able to it should have a good collection, good mix of fake as well as legitimate news sources. And these are essentially fed into a supervised learning approach, a supervised statistical model, which learns the statistical model that can tell apart that when given a new article can tell whether it is fake or legitimate, right? So this is the pipeline. This is an instance of any supervised learning method would do this, but I just wanted to highlight the way we approach it from a more methodical perspective. Okay, so the methods for fake news detection within the supervised learning approaches differ in the kind of features that they use to learn the model, and the kind of models that they learn. So let's look at the kind of features. So some of them consider features as being of various families. So one of them could be features from the source. So the source is the source of the information which you want to verify, or which you have labeled, which is labeled as legitimate, or in certain cases as fake news, right? So you have some credibility of that news source, which is by way of that handle and the metadata associated with that handle. And you have some amount of information about the network popularity of that news source. How many people are following this person? How many people is this person following? And what is the influence of that person? And so on and so forth. Right? Okay. So, and then there are features from the content as well. So which contains a lot of varieties. So one is about what words are used. The second one is what is the syntactic property of the content, whether it is past tense, present tense, etc. And there could be things about emotions. So from a casual observation, one would think that certain kinds of emotions are correlated with fake news, and certain other kinds of emotions are correlated with legitimate news. Well, I won't go into the details of the families, but you can find different families of emotions, and you can kind of consider whether they would be correlated with one family with fake news or the legitimate news, etc. And you can look at hashtags in URLs, which might offer some interesting perspectives, because some media sources are known to be biased, and URLs to those media sources could potentially tell you about whether that's likely to be authoritative or fake. And the content of the photos that you post. So if the photos are manipulated, that might contain some information about the veracity. And the content of the videos as well are quite an important source. Okay, so let's look at the features from the propagation part of it. And this is by far the most exploited kind of features within fake news detection algorithms. So you have somebody tweeting about a particular thing, and then you have people replying to it, you have people retweeting it, you have people replying to it with various kinds of text and so on and so forth. So there is a huge propagation information. There is information about how fast it was retweeted, how fast it was responded to, and various other kinds of things as well, right? So the propagation information in channels like microblogging environments, of which Twitter is an example, is quite rich, in the sense that there are some fake news detection algorithms that make exclusive use of propagation features and are able to achieve quite a good accuracy on many data sets. Okay, so let's look at the classification methodologies that have been used within the supervised fake news identification domain. So one of them is, of course, support vector machines, which has been popular since the 2000s. And then there are, of course, methods like naive Bayes and so on, which have been explored as well. So in this case, EMNLP 2011 paper on fake news identification talks about their applications. And conditional random fields, which was quite recently used in one of the papers in 2017, and deep neural networks is another one, and there are a variety of other kinds of things as well, so which we will not be able to go into deep into details of. So let's quickly move on to unsupervised fake news identification. So as I said earlier, the large majority of research in unsupervised fake news identification treat the task as one of anomaly detection. So what they do is they take a bunch of news articles, of which some are fake, of which some are legitimate. Most of them are legitimate, because if you pick it out from an authoritative source, it's likely that most of them are legitimate. And then you pass them on to a learning model, which learns a statistical model. And what you do is you pass these same documents over through that statistical model and score them based on conformance to that model. So in some sense, it is like how representative is the model of these documents. You can score each of these documents again. And you can look at certain documents which do not conform well to the behavior of the model that is learned over all the documents, and label them as fake news. In this case, there are only two things which are labeled as fake news, the red ones, and the other ones are labeled as legitimate news. So however, this makes, well, let's look at the example. Let's look at the tasks as such. You learn the character of the nature of the documents as a statistical model and identify those that deviate from the general character and label those as fake news. So one of the assumptions that this approach makes, the anomaly detection kind of approach makes, is that it presupposes or assumes that most news are not fake. Okay, it presupposes that only very few things are fake, because otherwise you would be learning the character of fake news. If 70% of the data set that you fed into the learning model was fake, your model would learn the character of fake news, and deviations from the character of fake news would be legitimate. So you would actually end up flipping it. So essentially, if you want to have this model where you want the statistical learning to focus on the legitimate news and the character of legitimate news articles, you would need to ensure that most of the news that you have in your corpus are not fake. Okay, this may be violated in many scenarios, I should say. Okay. So let's look at yet another paradigm of fake news identification from the unsupervised realm. But I'm just outlining a potential way of thinking about unsupervised fake news identification without making an assumption of the relative distribution between legitimate and fake news. Okay, so unsupervised fake news identification has been a very fertile area of research. So it's very important to address this problem here, because the supervised approaches work only in the presence of labeled data, and it's not often that you get labeled data for this kind of emerging scenarios, right? So unsupervised fake news identification is a very important task. And you could think of one approach which goes like the following. This is not a particular approach taken from a paper, but I'm just trying to put that put in a framework through which you can build an unsupervised fake news identification. So you could understand the scenario and identify on what dimensions the fake news varies significantly from legitimate news sources, right? You can look at the dimensions, you can explore the various kinds of dimensions, and we'll come back to that very quickly. And you identify news pieces from either extremes on those dimensions and label them as fake or legitimate. So on one extreme you would have some of the news articles being labeled as fake, and on the other extreme you have legitimate. And there is this wide area in between where you don't have any labels, right? So you could propagate the labels from the unlabeled to the unlabeled news pieces based on how similar they are to those labeled in the previous step. Okay, there could be other kinds of approaches for unsupervised fake news identification, but if you are able to identify the character of fake news and identify dimensions on which the character of fake news differs greatly from that of legitimate news, you could use this kind of a label propagation meta approach in order to arrive at an unsupervised fake news identification method. So let's look at what are these dimensions, what are these dimensions on which the fake news varies significantly from legitimate news sources. So one of them is that of propagation peaks, and this comes back to one of the points that I made earlier, which is that fake news tends to have many lives. Fake news tends to have multiple propagation peaks, whereas legitimate news tends to have only one peak. Okay, and I'll show you some example here, and this is from a paper in 2014 which says that these are propagation peaks. So this is one fake news article, and the number of shares that it had on this day was this much, what about 70 odd shares or retweets or whatever it is, right? Share is the Facebook version of it and retweet is the Twitter version of it, and then it died off, and later it came back up slightly. And later it came back up even more prominently, and slowly died off, etc. So with some peaks here and there. So it has had multiple lives. It came up, it died off, it came up, it died off, and so on and so forth. Whereas in the case of legitimate news sources, you get to see only one propagation peak, and that's when the actual event happens. Maybe if it relates to an event kind of fake news, event kind of legitimate news, which is, I mean, for example, if there is an election event, during the time of the election event, everything peaks and then it dies off slowly. So if you have multiple propagation peaks, you can, if you have too many propagation peaks for a particular article, you can confidently label that as maybe fake, and if there is only one propagation peak, then you can label it as legitimate, and then you have this wide gulf in between where you need to propagate these labels inward, right? Okay, so let's look at yet another dimension of variation, which this one is from ICDM 2013, where they talk about something called a diffusion network. So information on a topic diffuses from A to B. A is a user in a social network and B is a user in a social network. If they're connected and B retweets A's post on the topic, so we're talking about Twitter here. Okay, so that's how you induce an edge between A and B. So you create an edge from A to B if B is connected to A and B retweets A's post on the topic. And by this mechanism, you build what is called a diffusion network. And the diffusion network, these people found, are very different if you have a fake news article as against if you have a legitimate news article. So legitimate news diffusion pattern is much more connected. The diffusion network is much more connected, and the fake news diffusion pattern, the connectivity is quite shallow. So as you can see here, I'll refer you to details from the paper because I cannot cover everything here. So let's move on to the third dimension of variation. So this is something that I'm exploring currently, and this is a joint work with some collaborators, which is Anoop, who is a PhD student at the University of Calicut, and his advisor, who is Lajesh. So I have their names written on there as well. So here what we're trying to do is we're trying to make use of the assumption that fake news and legitimate news articles differ in terms of the affective character, in terms of the emotional content that they contain, right? So what we're saying is, if we take simply the lexical content of fake and emotional news and project them onto a space such as a text embedding space, then you might get a reasonable mixture here. However, if you amplify the emotion content, we expect that the legitimate and the fake news are kind of spaced out, because they differ in the kind of emotions that they contain, right? So this is of course an assumption, but we used this emotion amplification, and we found that a lot of supervised learning approaches and unsupervised learning approaches are able to make use of this newer representation in a much better manner to achieve much better accuracies for the fake news identification task. So effective character of content is yet another dimension of variation. Let's look at one more thing here, and then we'll stop. So this was from another paper in 2015, so not so old, it's quite a recent paper, so where they talk about the nature of responses that a fake news generates. So whenever there is a fake news, there is a high likelihood that people will respond with a lot of inquiries, right? So that's what they say. For example, if you post a fake news, this happened in the case of the Associated Press hacking, where the Associated Press hacked the Twitter account of Associated Press, which is a prominent media house in the US, was hacked, and they tweeted something about the White House being attacked and the president, which at that time was Obama, being injured, etc. So a lot of people responded by saying, "Oh my God, is it real? Is it true? Is it real or hacked? How does this happen? Is this legit?" and so on. So if you see a lot of inquiry posts, then that probably indicates that that's not a likely kind of event. Although of course, the journalistic one of the basic lessons in journalism is that you only want to highlight unexpected events in journalism, right? So this kind of, there is that kind of a nice balance that you need to strike. It should be reasonably surprising, all right, but it should not be too surprising that it is that it is unlikely to happen in the first place. Okay, so let's move on. What are the dimensions make fake news different from legitimate ones? So this is more of a thinking aloud kind of slide here. So where could we take topical coherence? Could we look at fake news articles and see how coherent they are with respect to a topic? If you find an article that is going from one topic to another, the second topic to a third topic, and so on, scattered all over the place, does it indicate something about the accuracy, something about the veracity of the news article itself, right? Does it indicate that it is fake? And does left or right political orientation correlate with fakeness or legitimateness? And referencing of contemporary as well as against historical events. I don't want to go into details here, but a lot of news that is generated in the political realm these days within India has a lot of referencing to events that go back many decades. And what does that mean? Does it mean that the point that they're trying to convey doesn't have enough factual support from recent events, and does that mean that it is correlated with fakeness and so on? And what about the narrative style itself? If you're highly confident or if you're skeptical, does it indicate something? Does skepticism indicate an amount of truthfulness? Because most scientific outcomes are embedded with a lot of skepticism. That being the character of scientific writing itself in some sense. And the presence of numbers or statistics, does it convey something? Does it convey that it is likely to be fake or it is likely to be legitimate, etc.? So you can look at various dimensions. The presence of quotations is another thing, and this is like a very fertile area of research because there has been very less effort or very less amount of investment from the data science community into unsupervised fake news detection. And unsupervised fake news detection can only thrive on the basis of a better understanding of the character of fake news. So I would say that if you're interested in this area, you should look at various dimensions on which the character of fake news differs from that of legitimate news, and you might be able to formulate a research question that could lead you to a couple of papers and maybe a PhD. Okay, so let's move on to something about data sets. There are tremendous amounts of data sets, and more are being created recently, in the last few months, in the last few years, etc. So I'll just highlight a few of them. One is called the liar data set, which is a textual data set comprising true and false news collected from something called politifact.com. And there is this Kaggle fake news data set. Kaggle, as some of you know, runs this data kind of competitions. So they have a data set called the Kaggle fake news data set, which is news articles tagged as fake using the bullshit detector Chrome API. And then there is a BuzzFeed news data set, which is centered on the US politics domain, but however, it has quite a lot of interesting tagged information. And if you're interested in looking at identifying image fake news, so many a time images are tampered with to convey a point which is not so factual, right? So there is this thing called the Wild Web tampered image data set, which is realistic tampered images disseminated through social media, which you can use as a fake, which you can use if you're interested in looking at fake news in the realm of images, right? Okay. So I think I will more or less stop here with the actual content. But let's get back to the question, which was the title slide here. So can data science combat fake news? So combating fake news would include a lot of things. One is about detection, which would include things like early detection, which is when you might want to detect the fake news before it reaches a lot of people, because as we saw, once it reaches a lot of people, it has this tendency to persist. So it may not be possible to get rid of its effects completely anymore. And you might want to see how to throttle fake news. So once you've identified something as fake, how do you prevent people from sharing it, right? Which you might want to do through kind of an interactive and an empowered manner, rather than saying that you'll just suppress this media source, because that goes against media independence and other kinds of things which are essential to democratic systems. And let us say that something has been detected and throttled, but it has traveled already through the network for some time. How do you repair the damages that they have already done? So that's quite an interesting question that has a lot of political undertones as well. That has a lot of things has to do with especially in the political domain. When you're talking about fake news in the political domain, repair itself is a very political question. Okay, so if we consider the target to be this one, which is an ultimate system that would be able to combat fake news and cleanse the modern society of the impact of fake news, then we are probably somewhere here. We're starting to see how the detection methodologies would look like. We haven't yet gone about to do some throttling, because that obviously involves some cooperation from the social media companies as well as new media companies and so on. So there are a lot of things that have yet been explored, but we are starting to see some amount of consolidation in the detection space as to how things could be done, and so on and so forth. So that's still a long way to go, and a lot of research to be done, which means that it's quite a fertile area for research in the next few years as well. So I think I'll stop there. I think I'll stop there, and I'll just hand it over to questions and comments. I'll take a look at the questions that have come here. So which is through this pollev.com/deepakp, and if you want to post any questions there, feel free to do that as well. Okay, so this is the set of questions that I've received on this pollev platform, which I'll just go through very quickly. So it's interesting to see a lot of questions having come in, and I would even think that if it were actually a question and answer session, I would not have gotten this many questions. So the first question is about which cognitive bias do you think caused Natalie the nurse's experiments result. So that's quite an interesting thing, but somehow I'm not sure I'm competent enough to answer that, because it's about what is so persistence of fake news and the fake news continuing to influence us long after it has been proven false is essentially an irrational behavior of the human mind, and that is potentially linked to some of the well-studied logical fallacies which might be something interesting to look at, but I'm not very sure about what it is, because that's outside my domain of exploration. Okay, so the next one is about whether the meta approach is similar to case-based reasoning. So of course, I mean, the meta approach is just a suggestion as to how you might be able to use some of the dimensions of variation towards coming up with an unsupervised fake news identification approach. And it has some elements of case-based reasoning, of course, in the sense that you're looking to propagate these labels using some similarity information. However, case-based reasoning, a prominent problem-solving methodology within the AI domain, within the classical AI domain, makes use of the assumption that similar problems have similar solutions. So here we do not have that two-part structure, which is problems and solutions. We only have a single article. So in that sense, well, in some sense, you can think of the solution as the diagnosis as to whether the article is fake and legitimate and so on. However, there is no sophisticated two-part structure to this. So this is more like a standard unsupervised technique. But I would think that its usage of some of the similarity information could potentially make it useful to explore some of the case-based reasoning concepts within the space as well. And what NLP techniques are to be learned to work in this domain? So the NLP techniques to be learned are, of course, I mean, all the standard NLP techniques could be used or could be brought into some sort of operation within the domain of fake news detection. For example, if you were to look at health fake news, you might want to do some linking with some external knowledge bases which are known to be authoritative. For example, things like WebMD, which are known to be very authoritative external knowledge sources. So those might be very interesting to do, very interesting to link to, which means that you might need to do some linking. And if you're looking at linguistic styles and being able to use linguistic styles, you might want to make use of things like dependency parsing and so on and so forth. So practically everything in the whole NLP spectrum might be useful in some domain of fake news or the other. So how to distinguish retweeted legitimate news from fake in terms of the dimensions discussed? I would think that you might be able to propagate the label from the news article to all its retweets, because if something is fake, then it's unlikely that its retweet is not fake, right? Because it's practically the same content, maybe an additional word or two here to indicate some opinion about that content, but you are not going to be refuting that content as such. So you might be able to propagate through the retweet links, propagate the labels through the retweet links as it is. So will it stop? Okay. Will it stop people from expressing freely? Okay, that's a very important question. That's a very interesting question, and I would think that there has been very little exploration into this, and this is actually more of a social science, a political science kind of question. Because let's say that you come up with a fake news detection mechanism, and the fake news detection mechanism gives you a score. What do you do with that score? Do you say that anything above a fakeness score of 0.5 will not be shown to any user? Which would mean that you can of course install a Chrome plugin, but this kind of goes against the notion of media independence, right? So, and it also goes against the notion of well, in the days of social media, everybody is a broadcaster, so it goes against the notion of freedom of speech and so on and so forth. So it's quite a loaded question. It needs to be explored. And one thing that I would like to say here is there was a recent expert high-level committee report on fake news and allied kind of things from the EU, which said that any presentation of fake news would need to be in a manner that it empowers the user in order to understand the misinformation, as against just a one-way communication saying that this has a fakeness score of 0.57, so we don't show you, or we label it as fake before showing it to you, and so on. So you need to bring the user into the equation, and you need to bring in some interactivity there, and that's essentially very important, especially when you're dealing with things like media, where you don't want to be doing any form of censorship at all. So while it might be fake to you, it is not to some. How do we agree what is fake? So most of the data science approaches have kind of sidestepped this problem and said that we source some labels from some kind of from users, right? So let's say that users label something as fake, then we treat that as fake. So we don't kind of try and dispute the user labeling. Of course, the generation of the user labeling and the nuance of generating the user labeling is could be subject to much more exploration. But that is not so much to do with data science, but to do with maybe social sciences in some sense. Okay, so many media might have the intent of earning revenue from displaying ads on fake news articles. So how to tackle this? So it's quite interesting to hear this question, and I'm very happy to be asked this question. However, I don't have any answers as such, but let me just share some perspectives on this. So these days most of the web is run on the basis of on ad revenues, right? Google, for example, makes makes most of its revenue from ads and so on. So bringing people in and getting people to visit your site, getting people to spend a lot of time on your website is quite an important thing. And that kind of many a time contradicts with showing factual things, because there are only so many things that are so interesting happening in the real world. So you often need to make up things to be able to gather the user's interest and make sure that the user stays in your website, so that you get your desired ad revenues and so on. So the intent of so ad revenue is basically the way in which most of the internet websites are run, and that by itself intrinsically does not have any commitment to the veracity of news articles or to the veracity of the news on which these or that is shown on the same pages as where these ads are run. So I'm not sure how to tackle it, but I think it's a very important thing to tackle. It might need to so essentially people start seeing that that the basic structure of the internet is itself the reason for fake news, because the incentives that operate on the internet, things like ad revenues and so on, have no commitment to truthfulness, right? So that's quite an interesting thing, and I think that will be subject to increasing number of studies in the next few years. So what if some negative people try and flag down illegitimate news? How to tackle this one? Yeah, so whenever you have something that goes against what you think, you have many a time people come across people tend to have this kind of rebel mentality, and that happens quite a bit in this social network called Quora that I follow quite a bit. So whenever there is somebody from one political party talking about certain things, and the other guy and it goes against a political party, and the people from the other political party come in and downvote the answers, that even if it be a very good answer, downvote those answers. And I've gotten some downvoted answers as well, and at some point the downvoted answers, Quora says that okay, this one has gathered enough number of downvotes, so we no longer show it to people, and they collapse it. So in some sense, the legitimate news that is already available, whatever it is there, might itself be kind of brought down. The fraction of legitimate news articles could also be brought down by means of these kinds of inclinations of people trying to flag down some kind of legitimate news articles. So that's once again it's a very social kind of issue. Which needs to be addressed through different kinds of things, but it probably has not much to do with data science approaches to it, or maybe it has. Everything. Well, whenever you are trying to interact with a media and do something with it, you are influencing the media. So essentially, you would be a party, you would be a stakeholder in that as well. So if the mechanism, coming to the last question, so if the mechanisms are not in place for checking the validity of the news until that time, that is something that could potentially, okay, so I guess this is going to this DB approaches thing. So if there is no mechanism to check whether the veracity of a fake news, the veracity of a news article, you would allow it to run as long as it can gather enough number of enough evidence within the knowledge bases, or through its footprints, or through its propagation patterns and so on, so that you can arrive at a determination as to whether it is fake or not. So that's something that could be, that could be a matter of interest when you're trying to identify early breaking fake news and so on. So, but whatever you need to do, you need to have some data, and in order to be able to get some data, you probably cannot wish away the fake news until that time, right? Because you don't know what is fake and what is not until you have some data, and the very process of gathering some data makes it so that the fake news has some life, has some duration during which it lives in the social media ecosystem itself. Okay, so that's about it. I think thanks very much for the questions, and these are all very interesting questions. And I assume that these questions and the mix of these questions also highlight the very interdisciplinary nature of the pursuit against fake news, because it touches upon a variety of disciplines: media, politics, public health, and a variety of things. And so, well, it's no coincidence that a lot of these questions have to do with some of those aspects of fake news, as they have to do with data science approaches as well. So thank you very much. It was a pleasure talking to you. So thanks.